Over the last 48 hours, Mount Semeru in East Java has barely paused for breath. Since just after midnight on December 11th local time, the volcano has fired off eruption after eruption, pushing its weekly total to more than 30 blasts and packing dozens of explosion quakes into just a few evening hours. Ash columns have punched up to about 100 meters above the summit, with plumes reaching roughly 4.3 kilometers into the flight levels, and aviation warnings that simply say explosive activity continues. Yet the alert level is still stuck at level 3 Siaga. No new casualties have been reported in the last 2 days, but the 13-kilometer exclusion zone around the summit remains in force, and the river valleys that carried destructive lahars earlier this month are back on high alert. In this video, we will break down what this 48-hour burst really tells us about Semeru, how close it might be to a more dangerous phase, and why people living along its slopes cannot afford to relax. If we zoom in on that 48-hour window, the pattern at Semeru looks less like a single outburst and more like a heartbeat that is sped up and refused to slow down. Just before 1 in the morning on December 11th local time, the volcano opened the sequence with a nighttime explosion recorded by Indonesia's monitoring network as one of more than 20 eruptions in the previous week. A few hours later, around sunrise, Semeru slipped into a kind of relentless rhythm. Within roughly half an hour, a cluster of 4 blasts sent ash into the sky again and again. One plume rose about 1,000 meters above the summit, the next about 800, then around 700, and the final and strongest of that series pushed ash to roughly 1,100 meters above the crater, putting the top of the column close to 4,800 meters above sea level. Witnesses described white to gray ash drifting off toward the west and southwest as the wind carried the eruption clouds away from the peak. Throughout this, the alert level stayed at level 3 Siaga, but the instructions from the observatory staff were anything but relaxed. People were told to stay at least 13 kilometers away from the summit and to avoid working or traveling in the valleys that drain the crater. Those channels carved by rivers such as the Besuk Kobokan are the natural runways for cold lahars and hot pyroclastic flows if heavier rain or a larger collapse releases loose material from the upper slopes. By evening, the numbers behind the scenes became more telling. Around mid-evening, another eruption sent a dense ash plume about 500 meters above the summit, drifting to the southwest. Not long after, a further blast produced an ash column around 700 meters high. Seismograms showed that between 6 in the evening and midnight on December 11th alone, there were dozens of explosion quakes along with signals from rockfalls and gas bursts. Then in the early minutes of December 12th, when clouds and darkness completely hid the summit, Semeru reminded everyone that you do not need to see an eruption to know that the volcano is still busy. Shortly after midnight, instruments at the observatory detected another strong eruption signal. This time, observers could not measure the ash column directly, but the seismograph showed a clear sustained pulse. In the 6-hour window from early evening to late night on December 12th, another series of explosion quakes was recorded with amplitudes and durations that fit the same pattern of ongoing unrest rather than a dying storm. This mix of frequent blast, continuous tremor, and repeated ash emissions is what monitoring agencies mean when they classify Semeru as being in a phase of continuing eruption. The volcano is not firing off a single dramatic event and then going quiet. It is holding a high, steady level of unrest, and for people living on its slopes, that kind of steady unrest is often the warning sign that something more serious could be building just below the surface. When a volcano like Semeru keeps up this kind of steady, explosive rhythm, the most dangerous effects are often not the ash columns you see on camera, but what happens when all that loose material on the slopes starts to move. Earlier this month, on December 5th and 6th, cold lahars rushing down from the volcano damaged around a dozen homes, a small mosque, and a roadside shop, swept away several motorbikes, and forced hundreds of residents in places like Dusun Sumberlangsep to evacuate to higher ground. Those flows were not triggered by one massive explosion. They were driven by heavy rain falling on fresh volcanic debris that was just waiting in the channels. That is why Indonesian authorities repeat the same warning in almost every update: stay at least 13 kilometers away from the summit and out of the valleys that drain the crater. Those valleys, including the Besuk Kobokan, are natural chutes for cold lahars and, in a worst-case scenario, for hot pyroclastic flows. With each eruption over the last week, Semeru has been loading those chutes with more ash blocks and loose rock. Seismic logs show not only dozens of explosion quakes, but also frequent rockfall signals as material breaks off the steep upper slopes. All of that loose debris is now sitting on an incline ready to move again if another burst of rain or a partial collapse lines up the conditions. For aviation, the threat looks different but is just as serious. Ash from Semeru has been detected up to about 4.3 kilometers above sea level, triggering repeated warnings to pilots and air traffic controllers. Volcanic ash is not like ordinary cloud. It is made of tiny, sharp fragments of rock and glass that can sandblast cockpit windows and damage jet engines in seconds. Villagers on the ground may see only a hazy gray sky, but aircraft flying overhead can be passing through a layer of ash that their instruments need to avoid. What makes this phase at Semeru so unsettling is that it sits in a kind of middle ground. The alert level is high, but not at the maximum. There has been no single headline-grabbing collapse in the last 48 hours, and many nearby communities are still trying to keep daily life running. Yet the volcano is clearly not calm. It is erupting again and again, steadily loading its slopes and river valleys with material that can move suddenly and violently when the right trigger arrives. For people living along the roads and rivers at the base of the mountain, the real question now is not only what Semeru is doing today, but what could happen if this steady unrest shifts into something bigger. In simple terms, a level 3 alert at Semeru means dozens of eruptions in a week of lahars. In the recent past, a 13-kilometer zone around the summit where daily life is officially not safe, and monitoring teams on duty around the clock. It is called siaga, or standby, because the volcano is clearly active and dangerous, with a real risk of further explosions, lahars, and pyroclastic flows. But it has not yet crossed into level 4, or was the highest alert, which is reserved for moments when a major destructive event is judged to be imminent or already underway, and large-scale evacuation becomes the urgent priority. From the outside, that one step between level 3 and level 4 may look small on paper. For people on the ground, it is the difference between living under strict restrictions and being told to drop everything and leave. When scientists and emergency planners look ahead from a level 3 situation like this, they do not see a simple yes or no question about whether Semeru will erupt big. Instead, they work with a spectrum of scenarios. In one, the volcano keeps doing more of what it is doing now. Frequent moderate eruptions, ash falling mostly on the upper slopes, occasional small lahars and rockfalls, but no single collapse that sends pyroclastic flows roaring far down the valleys. Life in nearby towns stays disrupted but manageable as long as people respect the exclusion zones and stay out of the rivers that drain the crater. In a more serious scenario, this steady unrest eventually builds toward a stronger explosive pulse or a partial collapse of the summit or upper cone. In that case, pyroclastic flows could spill into familiar valleys at highway speeds, and lahars could travel farther and faster, forcing rapid evacuations and causing damage well beyond what the lahar floods earlier this month produced. There is also the quieter possibility that activity will taper off again for a time, with fewer eruptions and less seismic noise, before Semeru slowly reloads and begins a new cycle months or years from now. The hard truth is that no instrument can tell residents exactly which of these paths the volcano will take, or on what day a shift might happen. Monitors can say with confidence that Semeru is in a state of high unrest, that its slopes and valleys are loaded with fresh material, and that lahars and pyroclastic flows remain a real risk whenever rain or collapse provides the right trigger. What they cannot offer is a guarantee that tomorrow will behave exactly like yesterday. For families who farm along the lower river valleys, for drivers who use the roads crossing those channels, and for people who still remember earlier disasters on these slopes, that uncertainty is the most exhausting part of living beside a restless volcano. It is also the reason why even a high but not maximum alert level deserves to be taken seriously long after the biggest headlines have faded. In the next part, we will look at what this means in practical terms for people living near Semeru today and for anyone who lives close to an active volcano anywhere else in the world. For people living on the slopes of Semeru, a level 3 alert is not just a color on a chart. It changes the rhythm of everyday life. Farmers who once worked fields close to the rivers now think twice before walking down to the water, especially when rain begins to fall on the upper slopes. Parents plan their days around the latest bulletins from the Volcano Observatory. Evacuation bags with closed documents and basic supplies stay packed by the door. Not because everyone expects to leave tonight, but because they know that when lahars or pyroclastic flows come, the time window to move can be measured in minutes, not hours. Community leaders and religious figures become informal communicators, helping spread the message from technical reports into practical decisions: which road to avoid, which bridge is closed, which hill has been designated as a safe gathering point. On the official side, volcanologists and civil protection teams work together to translate seismic lines and gas measurements into clear public advice. They watch for changes in the depth and character of earthquakes, beneath Semeru shifts in crater glow, spikes in gas emissions, or sudden swelling of the cone that could hint at magma moving upward. At the same time, they keep a close eye on the weather forecast because heavy rain on fresh deposits can be just as dangerous as a new explosion. When those signals line up in the wrong way, alerts are raised, sirens may sound, and roads into high-risk valleys are blocked. It is a constant balancing act, keeping people informed and ready without exhausting them with false alarms. For viewers far from Indonesia, Semeru's current phase is a reminder that many active volcanoes around the world sit in the same gray zone between quiet and crisis. Communities near Etna in Italy, Popocatépetl in Mexico, or Sakurashima in Japan all live with similar patterns of frequent small eruptions, ash falls, and periodic evacuations. The lesson is that you do not need a once-in-a-century super eruption for a volcano to reshape lives and landscapes. A long series of moderate events combined with heavy rain and steep terrain can be enough to damage homes, close roads, disrupt agriculture, and test the resilience of families living nearby. Understanding what alert levels mean, knowing the local evacuation routes, and taking warnings seriously, even when the summit looks calm, are some of the most important tools any community can have. In the final part of this video, we will step back and look at what Semeru's continued eruption tells us about living with natural hazards in general, and how people everywhere can turn early information into real preparedness before the next phase of unrest begins. In this episode, we have watched Semeru through a narrow window of time, but the pattern we see fits a much longer story. In just 1 week, the volcano has produced dozens of eruptions, some sending ash more than a kilometer above the summit and into flight levels around 4.3 kilometers. Seismic records show clusters of explosion quakes in the evening and at night, along with rockfalls and gas bursts that tell us loose material is constantly moving on the upper slopes. The alert level sits at level 3, Sage, which means the volcano is clearly dangerous, even without a single headline making blast. Authorities are holding the line on a 13-kilometer exclusion zone around the summit and warning people to stay out of the valleys that drain the crater, especially channels like the basic Kobokan that have already carried destructive lahars earlier this month. The fact that there have been no new casualties in the last 48 hours is good news, but it is also a reminder that careful monitoring and strict respect for hazard zones can save lives even while a volcano remains restless. Semeru shows what it means to live with a natural hazard that does not always behave in simple spikes. Instead of one dramatic eruption in silence, there can be long periods of steady unrest, during which small decisions matter: whether to build a home close to a river that has carried lahars before, whether to keep an evacuation bag ready, whether to pay attention when the alert level rises from green to yellow to orange. The same pattern appears around other active volcanoes and in other hazards, from river floods to major storms. Information arrives early in the form of seismic graphs, satellite images, or weather models, and the question is whether we turn that early information into real preparedness in our daily lives. If you live near an active volcano or in any region exposed to floods, storms, or earthquakes, let Semeru be a quiet signal in the background. Take a moment to learn what the alert levels in your country mean, where your safest evacuation routes are, and what you would want in a simple go bag if you had to leave on short notice. Preparation does not remove the risk, but it changes the outcome. And if you appreciate calm, detailed explanations of events, like this continuing eruption at Semeru, and you want to stay informed about volcanoes and other natural hazards around the world, consider subscribing to this channel and turning on notifications. That way, when the next phase of unrest begins, you will have clear, reliable information ready before the first images start to circulate.